Hello, welcome to Genesis Mentors. This is Sagar Kamath. And today we're going to discuss something which has caught public attention in a big way ever since it was passed on the 11th of December 2019. So we're talking about the Citizenship Amendment Act or CAA, and this is something which has raised intense controversy and debate across the country. Okay, not only in December or around it when it was passed, but continues to excite violence and controversy even today. But before we discuss what exactly the act is and whether or not it's exclusionary, inclusionary, discriminatory, or simply something that a country needs to do moving ahead in its journey, it is important to understand why exactly the backdrop of why exactly the CAA has raised such controversy. Now, to put it simply, if one were to look at the act itself, the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 makes an amendment, a pretty significant amendment to the Citizenship Act of 1955. Now, I'll take you through the protocol of what exactly the amendment is, but broadly speaking, it centers on people from the Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi and Christian faiths who might have escaped religious persecution from three countries in India's immediate neighborhood. Now, those three countries namely being Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. Now, the Act specifies, or the Act seeks to specify a greater sense of inclusion for these communities, religious minority communities from these three countries, and it seeks to fast track the process of citizenship or naturalization for people who have escaped religious persecution from the aforementioned three countries. Now, as a result, there is a certain cutoff date. The cutoff date would be in December of 2014. So, December 31st, 2014, if you have large numbers of people from the aforementioned faith and from the aforementioned countries, namely Pakistan, Afghanistan and Bangladesh, who have forcefully been asked to or forcefully had to migrate to India, right? Now, even though if their immigration has not been approved formally, so in a sense they've sought asylum in India from the three above countries, the act or the amendment to the act seeks to grant them citizenship because it looks at itself or it looks at India as a custodian of Indic population whose ethnic roots and whose cultural roots might be from within the subcontinent and who might face religious persecution in the subcontinent. So what that means is, if there is someone or there is a community from, let's say, Pakistan, a non-Muslim community, let's say Hindus or Sikhs or Jains, Buddhists, Parsis or Christians, who over the period of years, and this is something which we have documentary evidence for, have faced religious persecution, whether it's in Bangladesh, Pakistan or in some cases Afghanistan, and have had to flee to India, then under the Amendment Act, if their transit has been completed before the 31st of December 2014, as in they have been part of the subcontinent since then, been a part of India since then, the Act would seek to grant them citizenship. Now, this Act of course has sparked immense debate because of multiple reasons. And the most vitriolic attacks against the Act along the lines of how this is the first time in India's 70-odd year of independent history that there is a protocol which specifically seeks to create any kind of a bias or any kind of a prejudice on religious lines. So, for instance, anybody who went through the protocol would be clear that it's not just seeking to give citizenship to minority communities or religious minorities, persecuted religious minorities from the aforementioned three countries. It specifically looks at certain religious groups, which is Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi and Christian, which would mean even if you are from one of the minority sects within Islam, and if you happen to come from these communities, persecuted sects within Islam, for instance, let's say the Ahmadiyya Muslims or the Shia or the Sufi, or if you're trying to escape religious persecution from the Talibanization of Afghanistan, the Act doesn't actually grant you citizenship, okay, at least not under its protocol. Now, this has of course raised a lot of questions, and it's been a focus of intense debate across the country, from college campuses to media houses to civilian discourse. But while in intense debate or something which is compelling across the country, a compelling debate across the country is always encouraged in a democracy, and it's something which a healthy democracy does need. It is also important to ask the question that any debate which rages on any act passed by the government should first seek to understand what is it that the act stipulates from an unprejudiced perspective and then engage in holistic debate. And one of the great ironies with the CA is that neither has the in-power political party, the BJP and the NDA government currently, the coalition, neither have they sought to clearly extrapolate what the act means, nor has the opposition sought to address the exact grounds on which they critique the act. And as a result, from college campuses across the country to media houses, debates have been running absolutely riot, to the point where people are inventing fictitious reasons and fear-mongering to create a state of absolute panic about the CAA. So we'll get into all of these individual debates through this section, and hopefully by the end of it, regardless of which side of the fence you want to lie, whether you're in support of the act or whether you seek to oppose it, it will at least be a healthy, informative discussion wherein, regardless of your perspectives, you'd be doing it from an informed lens. Now, to understand first of all what are the backdrops to the CAA, it's important to go back to the year 1947, when one nation in the subcontinent, British India, becomes two and eventually three nations. So I'm of course talking about the Indian partition, wherein one nation of what was historically the Indian subcontinent becomes two nations, India and Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, again would go through a split in 1971, with East Pakistan declaring independence as Bangladesh. So what was once one subcontinent with a plethora of different faiths, Islam being one of them, is now three countries. Afghanistan, keep in mind, is not part of the Indian subcontinent, neither geographically nor culturally. Afghanistan is the first gateway that if you're traveling from, let's say, the subcontinent, if you travel beyond the Hindu Kush, the first country, of course, you encounter in Central Asia would be Afghanistan. So why is exactly Afghanistan a part of the CAA debates? Why has that country been looped in? Right, now as of 1947, when the idea of Pakistan was first proposed and then it was taken ahead, it's important to understand what was the initial tenet of the Pakistan claim. The idea of Pakistan being that there cannot be, at least that's what the Muslim League in 1947 proposed, and an idea which was encouraged within undivided India, was that Hindus and Muslims, going back into their collective histories, do not share common collective histories. In the sense, the argument was raised that the hero figures and the villains, from an Islamic point of view and from a Hindu point of view, from an Indian point of view, were not actually the same, right? The argument was raised, this is famously called as a two-state theory, that if you do not share a collective past and if you do not share a collective present, it's highly unlikely that you're going to share a collective future. Now, those who felt this was the case between Hindus and Muslims in the subcontinent believe that it's in everyone's best interest if Hindus and Muslims were to ghettoize, okay, live separately. A series of census maps in 1947 were used, British census maps were used to further reinforce this point, that even otherwise, by and large, the Muslims of the subcontinent have all amassed either in northwest or they were amassed in the east, that is in Bengal. Now, as flawed as this argument might have been, this was the moving ground behind creating Pakistan in not just one part of the subcontinent, but in two parts. And as a result, Pakistan is a nation which comes into existence with not only just a confused sense of self, but also with a confused sense of geography. East and West Pakistan are separated by India, a country which they would potentially be hostile with. So even as an argument, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But nonetheless, the idea of Pakistan was rooted in some of the troubled soils of partition, and relationships between the two countries, India and Pakistan, have never actually taken off. Okay, it's very difficult. I mean, you might think of the Koreas and you might think of the Palestine-Israel conflict, but very rarely have neighboring countries engaged in such animosity. And what makes the Indian question of the subcontinental problem even more unique is that India and Pakistan are not truly neighbors. One has to understand this is historically one country. So it's not just a neighboring country that we have a problem with. Nepal is a neighboring country, Bhutan is a neighboring country. You can argue that Myanmar is a neighboring country, but Pakistan is not a neighbor, right? It is historically one nation which has been split. Now, during that time, the principal argument that the Muslim League was making was that the Muslims of the subcontinent, and in their eyes, at least the uncorrupted Muslims of the subcontinent, those not corrupted by Hindu values, had to ensure that they remain culturally safe, and as a result had to form Pakistan. So the idea was that those Muslims who continued to stay in India were essentially lost causes. They had become way too Indianized, they had assimilated with the subcontinent, and they'd lost their Islamic flavor. And as a result, the only true Muslims, the pure Muslims, were going to be a part of Pakistan. Now this is an argument which was made in 1947, and within the early few decades, it was quickly clear that the argument itself, that religion as in theory is enough to run a state, even though you might not really have figured out anything else. That argument proved to be false. And Pakistan probably starts to regret the split more so than India does within a couple of decades. But there is a key moment which takes place at the very start of the two countries, the journeys of the two countries. That is when India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the first Pakistani Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan signed what is called a gentleman's agreement, called as the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. Now, according to this pact, both nations which had a sizable minority of, let's say, religion belonging to the other side. So, for instance, there was a sizable number of Muslims who had stayed back in India, and there was a sizable number of Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs who stayed back in Pakistan, even after partition. So the idea was, this is supposed to act like the minority in the other side, whichever it might be, was supposed to act as a bargaining chip to ensure political stability in the subcontinent. What it means is that Pakistan was supposed to treat its minorities at par with the rest of the population, in exchange for India treating its minorities at par with the majority of the subcontinent. So that would mean that if Pakistan is concerned about Muslim treatment in India, to ensure that Muslims are treated well in India and to get like a safe guarantee that that would continue to happen, it would have to treat the Hindus and Sikhs and the Buddhists living in its part of the world, it would also have to treat them equally. This is often called as the critical hostage theory, where you keep hostages or your own hostage in an enemy territory and keep one of theirs as your hostage, and the safe treatment of each hostage depends on each other. You treat their hostage well, they treat your hostage well. Now, of course, as the decades wore on, India clearly never planned to use the minorities in the subcontinent as hostages. We have historically always maintained an inherently secular stance. Even before the constitution, the dynamic flavor of the subcontinent was even otherwise inherently secular. Pakistan, on the other hand, struggled to keep up its favorable treatment of hostages or its minority because it's never inherently secular. So as the 60s and 70s and 80s and the Cold War flavor caught on, Pakistan seeks to become increasingly more theocratic, with far-right extremist groups, religious extremist groups, Islamist groups, jihadi forces start to make a presence in the 80s and 90s. Now automatically, once Pakistan comes under that kind of an influence, it becomes impossible for minorities who have till then been at best tolerated, and now they find the conditions even more intolerable. Also, what is important to understand is that it's the 1980s which marks a key shift in Pakistani political structures, because it's through the 80s that in Pakistan's neighborhood, which is Afghanistan, a country which is essentially the gateway into Central Asia, the United States fights a covert war against the Soviet Union. This is often called as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's an invasion where the Russians, at the fag end of their attempt to create a communist system in the East, in the 80s invaded Afghanistan and tried to create a communist system. Now this is of course one of the key moments of the Cold War, where one side enters a relatively neutral playing ground, like in this case Afghanistan, The other side, in this case the US, seeks to balance out the equation or balance out the odds. So the US, led by their intelligence departments including the CIA, led a covert war against the Soviet Union by funding, arming and training Mujahideen or Islamist groups within Afghanistan. Now the groups were motivated on the pretext that the Soviets are trying to bring in a godless state, a godless atheistic state. And as a true Muslim or a true Afghan Muslim, one has to resist it. Now the Mujahideen, or the soldiers of God as they were called, who fought the Soviets for 10 years, they came from all walks of life. Not all of them were necessarily extremist fighters. But the training and the arming of the Mujahideen was something that the US wanted Pakistan to do. That's because it didn't quite want to reveal its hand in the anti-Soviet war. So for 10 years, Pakistan gets access to US weapons and begins training, arming and mobilizing hundreds of thousands of fighters, most of them who are young Afghan boys, indoctrinating them and sending them back into Afghanistan, and this process goes on for 10 years. So the institutions that Pakistan sets up to create this jihadist atmosphere, which not only has an influence on its own people, but also attracts actual radical Islamist groups, like for instance Al-Qaeda. So Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda actually look at the Soviet war or the anti-Soviet war, which ranges through the 80s in Afghanistan. They look at that as an opportunity. So Bin Laden would fight the Soviets, ironically using covert US aid for 10 years, supported by Pakistan. Now the experiment of training Afghan Mujahideen and eventually quelling the forces of the USSR, the Russians had to pull out in '89 because they were nearing bankruptcy, and shortly thereafter the USSR crumbles. So this experiment of successfully repelling the Soviets from Afghanistan is a seminal moment in Pakistan's history, because it realizes that the same tactics which were responsible for quelling the Soviets and the same personnel who were responsible for doing that can also be then moved to the Indo-Pak borders in disturbed areas such as Kashmir. So '89 is when the Soviets pull out, and physical transfer of personnel, people who have fought the Soviets, the Red Army in Afghanistan, they physically moved across into Kashmir as insurgents, and the Kashmir insurgency begins. '89, keep in mind, is also the period when the insurgency reaches such violent proportions that close to 500,000 Pandits, Hindu Pandits from the Kashmir Valley, would have to leave the valley forever. So this reconstitutes or reorganizes the demographics of the region. Now, the jihadism or the militancy of Kashmir has taken on a very, very different flavor post 1989, because it's not necessary today that groups which are fighting in Kashmir are necessarily all from Kashmir, be it Indian Kashmir or Pakistani Kashmir. This has now become like a battleground. How does all of this have to do? What does all of this have to do with the CAA? Through the last 70 years, one thing has become clear, that as far as minority populations is concerned, non-Muslim minorities are concerned, be it in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and with the Talibanization of Afghanistan, in Afghanistan as well, it has become increasingly unbearable to actually live as a minority under these regimes. It's almost unbearable to live even as a majority. These systems are economically incompetent. They don't really have any kind of a visionary outlook. To say that they are a developing economy is also an overstatement. But particularly in terms of human rights violations, and particularly human rights with regards to minorities, these three countries have atrocious records. The non-Muslim population of Pakistan has fallen from somewhere around 20% in the 1950s to under 2% in 2019. Now, what that means is, when you have that kind of a demographic transition, one of a few things is happening. A, you have had people who have been converted en bulk. B, you've had people who were killed. C, and that's the only third alternative, they've actually escaped. Because there's no other way you can explain such a large change in demographics, especially religious demographics. The 2014 cutoff was chosen by the government because till 2014, Starting from the 1970s, there have been three major influxes of non-Muslim populations or minority populations, religious minorities, who have come into the subcontinent or entered India from these countries, be it Pakistan, Afghanistan or Bangladesh. Afghanistan mainly begins post-1995 with the Talibanization of Afghanistan. Pakistan has been an ongoing problem, and Bangladesh has had unremittent migrations into Assam, West Bengal and Tripura. Now, the immigrants coming from these three countries can be classified in two categories. You can have economic refugees, people who are looking to better themselves. Right now, these are illegal migrants. They're seeking to better themselves because A, they find themselves with no opportunities in their home country. They jump the fence into India and try to seek opportunities in India. And then there are those who might have had a fairly decent standard of living in their host countries, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh, and the only problem is that they have been religiously persecuted. Now, you might argue, is that good enough reason for India to take asylum? The religious persecution of minorities in Pakistan and Bangladesh we've had documentary evidences, and not just India, but even independent organizations, including the UN, have had a long charter of documenting crimes against minorities. These range from forceful marriages, rapes, conversions, killings, under Pakistan's infamous blasphemy law. So for something as simple as a member of the minority community, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, if you get into an argument with, let's say, a person who has political influence or is from the majority sect of Islam, the blasphemy laws in the country essentially allow local level panchayats to not only try you under Sharia courts, but also execute you. The executions are, while they're not necessarily backed by the state, but they're not even opposed. So you have no formal policy on them. But if you're found guilty in a Sharia court under blasphemy charges, where the charges could be anything, you could be accused of burning the Quran, you could be accused of insulting Muslim rituals or Muslim values, and even hearsay charges or hearsay accusations are often good to go. That can serve as evidence. In such a situation, the punishment, the punitive punishments in these cases is death, and often barbaric practices such as death by stoning are administered. So religious persecution of minorities is a very serious concern. It has a long documentary evidence, and it's in a part supported by the state. So to escape these genocidal tendencies, when you have minority groups seeking asylum in India, the Citizenship Amendment Bill seeks to amend the Citizenship Act of 1955 and grant fast-track citizenship to these groups. Now, what is the huge hue and cry about this issue? For starters, the principal debate that is being raised in India is that if India is a secular country, why are we looking at certain religious minorities or certain religious groups and excluding Muslims? Now, let's first look at the arguments that the CA would seek to offer before we reach a consensus of our own. The Act and the government would look at the situation. Why exactly are, let's say, Muslims excluded from this? And the answer is that Pakistan and Bangladesh have Islam as a state religion. They are officially theocracies. Even though Bangladesh sought to pull itself away, Bangladesh is not a secular government. It has Islam as a fundamental part of its constitution. So too Pakistan, and to a lesser extent even Afghanistan. Now, since these countries are theocracies, the day the majority faith in these countries, that is Islam, the day Muslims in these countries feel religiously persecuted, that's the day where the whole idea of Pakistan collapses. That is not to say that Muslims do not undergo atrocities in these countries. But if if let's say a majority of the Muslims or Muslims as a community undergo religious persecution in these countries, when in fact they are Islamic countries, then that's the day when the idea of Pakistan as a state for Muslim collapses. And then we can restart the partition debates, right? Because theocracy as a faith or as a faith-based system would have collapsed across the subcontinent. So Muslims as a monolithic entity cannot be included under the CAA. But you would argue, what about minority sects within Islam? Because Shia in Pakistan undergo immense persecution, as do the Sufi. That's also the faith of the Baha'i or the Ahmadiyya. These are faiths or sects within Islam which are prone to immense persecution. So why aren't they included over here? Now it is also important to note that yes, while it is true that the Baha'i or the Ahmadiyya do undergo or do go through persecution, the fact also remains that when the original argument for Pakistan was proposed, the Sufis and the Ahmadiyyas were actually some of the most important proponents of the two-state theory. And that's because while they might be relative minorities in a Sunni-dominated Pakistan or a Shia-dominated Pakistan, the fact also remains that historically the people who chose to migrate to Pakistan, or the people who chose to become part of a Muslim subcontinent, or as a part of a country which was exclusively meant for Muslims on the subcontinent, they have shown historically have shown great animus towards Indic civilizations, especially idol worshippers, such as Hindus. Now as a result, Hindus or Christians, or for that matter Jains and Buddhists and Sikhs, living in Pakistan have also faced over the years religious persecution from these communities, who in turn might face religious persecution from the majority. So if there is going to be a separate state, or if there is going to be a separate project for, let's say, the Ahmadiyya, the Sufi or the Shia of Pakistan, now well, that's certainly not something that India can accommodate within its territory. The argument would then be that if these groups essentially need to have their own state, since they have been otherwise persecuted, and if somehow that state has to be handled by India, then India legitimately can ask for more territory as well. Because in 1947, the original argument which even the International Congress was making, and recommended by people like M.K. Gandhi, was that the subcontinent needs to have its rainbow influences, its plethora of influences, and it cannot be a theocracy. It has to be a secular country where all religions are treated equally. Now, the initiators behind the Pakistan experiment clearly disagreed with that thought process. And they thought differently, and they said, no, Islam has to be taken separately. Now, when you get to sects within Islam, and when we're talking about Islam, I'm not talking about Indian Islam, I'm talking about the Islam that chose to separate itself. Within that Islam, if there is sectarian persecution of the Baha'i or let's say of the Ahmadiyya, now tackle that problem even on humanitarian grounds. Since Pakistan originally was a country that even these groups sought, to tackle that problem on humanitarian grounds, the argument would have to be that India deserves more territory. Whereas if you look at non-Muslim groups living in these countries under theocracies and facing religious persecution, then if you escape from these countries, there is no other country that you can go to. There is no other country in the immediate vicinity or anywhere else for that matter which is going to welcome Indic population trying to escape religious persecution from these three countries. The second major debate that is raised against the CAA, advocates or anti-CAA protesters would often tell you that this is violation of Article 14 of the Constitution. And Article 14 argument is a much touted argument. But the question is, let's now once again look at whether at all it violates Article 14. What does Article 14 say? The opponents of the CAA would tell you that Article 14 is violated because Article 14 of the Constitution insists that as an Indian, regardless of your faith, the Article 14 basically focuses on equality under Constitution. So regardless of your ethnic balance or any background, your religious background or your political ideologies, you are entitled to equality under Indian Constitution. Now Article 14 does talk about equality or does promote the idea of equality. However, this is often misunderstood. While equality is a much touted value, if we were to literally apply the provisions of Article 14 to everyone who's currently residing in India, forget about illegal immigrants and forget about what rights they should get. Even if you simply apply the protocol of Article 14 across the subcontinent to all its current inhabitants, you'll find numerous affirmative actions that the government of India has taken since independence to be in violation of Article 14. For instance, something which is responsible for the transformation of Indian demographics, the reservation quota under the Mandal Commission, which, regardless of which side of the debate again they rest, one must acknowledge the immense good that reservation systems or caste-based reservation systems have done to alleviate historically disprivileged population or disenfranchised population, to alleviate them from the absolute depths of poverty of not just money but even wisdom, and to make them an integral part of the community. But even those protocols would be in violation of Article 14 if we were to apply the provisions of Article 14 that generally. You'll have other provisions such as the infamous Article 370, also revoked in the last year, which treated people of Kashmir as permanent residents and granted them special status. Even that would be considered violation of Article 14. Special concessions given to tribal minorities in a bid to keep up their tribal traditions would also be considered violation of Article 14. So why is it that these debates are not raging? And the answer is simple. Article 14 is not to be applied in a generic sense where you're trying to impose an idea of equality over everyone regardless of their circumstances. The idea of Article 14 is that if you have a group of people who can be thought of as demographically homogeneous, within that group you have to practice equality, which would mean that if you have, let's say, the SC/ST communities who can be thought of as one homogeneous group whose basic requirements to ensure that they become part of not only political but administrative setups of the country require reservation quota or require a certain amount of reservations, be it in education or employment. If you think of that group as homogeneous, the provisions of Article 14 apply, wherein every member of that community has to be treated as equal. Then there cannot be discrimination practiced where someone gets more of a reservation, someone gets less of it. Even till Article 370 was in existence in 2019, before its revocation, the idea was not that Kashmir as a whole necessarily has to be linked or created as equal with the rest of the country. The Indian Constitution acknowledged that Kashmir had some specific problems and we never had the opportunity of conducting the plebiscite. So the original plebiscite, and we've discussed this, for those who are not familiar with this discussion, you might want to take a look at the first input class that we had, the one where we discussed Article 370 in detail. So if you have a demographic population which shares enough commonalities, people within that demography are to be treated at par. So to compare the religious persecution that the non-Muslim populations in these three countries went through and continue to go through, and somehow try to equate that with sectarian violence practiced within Pakistan or Afghanistan, sectarian violence felt by the Baha'i, the Ahmadiyya, is not really a fair argument. And we also talked about why, if you seek to include Muslims as a monolithic community, and if you seek to include religiously persecuted Muslims as a monolithic community, then that would only be possible the day when the idea of Pakistan or the idea of a Muslim theocracy in the subcontinent completely collapses. Because the whole agenda or the whole initiation of the idea is that Pakistan is for Muslims, or Pakistan is for those Muslims who sought, according to the Muslim League, that it would be impossible to live in a Hindu-dominated India. So the CA, for practical purposes also, cannot make the distinction of trying to link Islam as a monolithic entity. We've also talked about the reasons why it cannot seek to link certain sects of Islam, because those sects have also historically showed an animus towards cultures of the subcontinent. They were in fact those proponents or early proponents of the two-state theory. In fact, if you look at the subcontinent, there are other minority groups, non-Muslim minority groups, who have also been excluded. For instance, there were few voices in the anti-CAA protest who asked a fairly legitimate question: what about the Tibetans? Okay, now what about the Tibetans? Why isn't India seeking to redress their grievances? The Tibetan government has been in exile for the best part of 50 years now, with the Dalai Lama having a base of operations in Dharamshala, and he finds it impossible to go back to his home country of Tibet. He's possibly never going to see it in his life. Now, the Tibetans are not granted concessions under the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, and that's because citizenship and asylum are two fundamentally different issues. The Tibetan government, which is in exile, is primarily made up of asylum seekers. Now, who's an asylum seeker? If, for instance, you have a person knocking on your doors in desperate need of your aid, a country is not necessarily, according to even Geneva Convention, a country is not obliged to grant that person citizenship. But there is also a protocol that each country must follow, each civilized country must follow, which is called as the non-refoulement policy. Which would mean, if a person who's trying to escape any kind of persecution knocks on your door for help, even if you do not want to grant that person citizenship, you cannot demote or you cannot deport that person to the same country from where he or she came from, because that's the country which is seeking to kill him. This is a non-refoulement policy, which would mean if there are Muslim groups or non-Muslim groups trying to escape religious persecution who seek to come into India or who are already on India's doorsteps, trying to come in from Bangladesh, Afghanistan and Pakistan, regardless of their religion, India has to abide by the non-refoulement policy, which would mean you cannot send them back to the exact same country that they're trying to escape. This applies regardless of your religion. But just because you cannot send them back doesn't mean that you're forced to grant them citizenship. They continue to remain in your country as asylum seekers. So a person who's an asylum, or a community which is an asylum, which is essentially what the Tibetans are, the reason they're not granted or accorded citizenship is because theoretically Tibet or the government of Tibet is in exile on a temporary basis. However unfanciful the chances, the idea is that there would come a time when the Chinese who rectify their wrongs will move out of Tibet, and Tibet once again would be for Tibetans. Because keep in mind, the Tibetans who are in India, including the Dalai Lama, are not trying to escape the nation of Tibet or the state of Tibet. They are trying to escape the Chinese, who are a foreign power, an occupying power. If you had Tibetans trying to escape religious persecution inflicted on them by other Tibetans, then you can have an argument, because then the minority group which escaped to India would never have an option of going back. And that's also true with religious minorities or non-Muslim religious minorities coming from Pakistan. If there is a Hindu group or a Muslim or a Sikh group or a Buddhist or a Jain group which is coming into India, or even a Christian group coming into India from Pakistan, because conditions towards minorities or their religion have become deplorable, we know from documentary evidence that situations in Pakistan have gotten worse over the years. So it's not that you're looking at a some set date in the future where you can reverse this trend, and hence the question of citizenship arises. Another set of people have asked, what about people who escaped the Sri Lankan civil war, the Tamil minority who escaped from Sri Lanka and who are now living as refugees in Tamil Nadu? Now the question there remains, was the Sri Lankan civil war, as brutal as it was it something where the rest of the world was looking at that as an inevitability in the future? In fact, now we've gone past 1 decade of the end of the Sri Lankan civil war. The LTTE has been defeated. Sri Lanka is a state of largely, it's been a state of peace, and atrocities against Tamil minorities have also all but ended. Which would mean at any stage, the asylum seekers who are in India, Tamil minorities who are trying to get asylum in India, they always have the option of going back to Sri Lanka, their home country. That option doesn't exist with these groups though. And as a result, the question of citizenship arises. So from a practical standpoint also, if you're looking at what the CA tries to do, or what is the protocol that it seeks to bring in, you would understand that when looked at from a lens, the CA is inclusionary, where it seeks to include a lot more people. Now let's look at the last question though, last opposition. Is the CA exclusionary? Does it seek to exclude Muslims? And in this case, the CA has often been compared to Trump's Muslim ban. Now, there lies a myth about what the CA seeks to do, because far from it being exclusionary of any group, Muslim or non-Muslim, the CA is simply increasing the scope of the Citizenship Amendment Act or the Citizenship Act of 1955 and including additional people in it. If there is an individual Muslim or a group of Muslims who want to escape Pakistan for whatever reason, economic reasons or for religious persecution, they are just as eligible to apply for citizenship, Indian citizenship, as anyone else on the planet. They would have to, of course, clear due protocol and undergo the naturalization process, which is a 12-year period, wherein they would rest within the country, seek employment and live according to Indian norms. And once naturalized, they would be granted Indian citizenship regardless of their faith. This is the Citizenship Amendment, and this is the Citizenship Act of 1955 in terms of what one has to do if you're not born in the subcontinent or not born in India but seek Indian citizenship. The Amendment Act hasn't actually altered that at all. So the people asking the questions, why are Muslims excluded? Now, Muslims aren't excluded. Muslims are not excluded from the Act itself. The Act continues to be looking at citizens or potential citizens regardless of their religion. It's the non-Muslim communities from these three countries which have been granted membership or citizenship en masse. Now, you would argue that still constitutes discrimination. Why can't Muslims be granted citizenship en masse? And the answer, like I mentioned a little while ago, is that the day Muslims from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan have to be granted citizenship en masse would be the day that the partition argument can once again be stirred, because then the whole idea of Pakistan collapses as a country meant for Muslims in the subcontinent. In closing, it is important to understand that any debate on the CAA, as encouraging as it is and as required as it is for democracy or a healthy democracy, must seek to focus on the original facts of a policy rather than engage in fear-mongering. And unfortunately, neither has the central government come out and clarified this stance, nor has any opposition party actually targeted the right reasons. The question of whether the CAA is something that we require at this moment can be a legitimate question, but it's one that is not being asked. People opposing it are of the opinion that if you actually oppose it, you're somehow secular, and if you promote it, you're somehow asecular. When in fact the act isn't discriminating any one religious authorities at all. There is a clear reason why the majority faith of these three countries cannot be granted citizenship en bulk, certainly not without increases in territories. It's estimated that there's around 30,000 people who are going to be direct beneficiaries of the act, who would come from Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi and Christian faiths. One other thing which doesn't get highlighted at all is that even after being granted citizenship, the individuals who have been granted this under the act will have to live under what are called enhanced obligations, which essentially amount to government scrutiny for a set amount of period, post which they can become naturalized Indians. So which would mean even after being granted citizenship, they're not going to be treated as absolutely equal with the rest of the people. They will have to undergo enhanced obligations. Their movements could be restricted. There could be close supervision by the government. They'll be allowed into only certain sectors before the government can vet their claims that they in fact are people escaping religious persecution. So for anyone who feels that this act can be misused, that absolutely anyone can come out from these countries and say, I'm a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh, and just walk into the country. Now that's not quite going to happen. Even if you manage to lie your way past the authorities when you first come in, you'll have to undergo or live under enhanced obligations for an indefinite number of years. Now, which would mean that those who tout Article 14 to oppose CAA must also understand that even after these people have become nationalized or have become citizens, they're not going to be treated at par with the rest of the citizens, at least not immediately. So even that can be thought of as a violation of Article 14. But that's not how Article 14 is supposed to be used. Last but not the least, there's another parallel set of fearmongers who would seek to convince you of the idea that somehow, once the Citizenship Amendment Act passes, maybe it is not discriminatory, maybe it is what it is. But the government will follow this up with the nationwide National Registry for Citizens, or the NRC. Now the NRC is not an act yet, We do not quite know its policies, we do not quite know its protocol, they're not even being set in stone. And it's not a bill which is passed through the parliament. So really debating what the NRC is going to bring in is quite futile. The fearmongers would insist that under a nationwide NRC, where documentary evidence of who your forefathers were and the fact that they were also residents of the subcontinent, clearly if you have to provide proof of your ancestors and have to prove that they were a part of the subcontinent, you might struggle. Now your struggles might be not limited to your religious backing. You could struggle if you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. But the idea is that, or at least that's the theory, that if you're not able to convince the government that you are from this part of the world, you don't have documents to prove that. If you're a Muslim, because you don't have documents, you will be immediately deported to Pakistan. And if you're a Hindu, even if you don't have documents to say that you were an Indian or your ancestors were Indians, somehow you can lie your way through the CAA. Now this is a bizarre argument. Let's understand this a little more. The argument seeks to say that if you have a Hindu who struggles to prove his identity or the identity of his ancestors, he can still say that he was a resident of Pakistan and has come into the subcontinent, and as a result under CAA would get citizenship. Whereas a Muslim who fails to qualify under the NRC, A, might get deported to Pakistan, and B, can't come back into India or can't even make a claim that he came to India from Pakistan because Muslims are excluded under CAA. Now this is a bizarre claim to say the least, but because it's generated so much fear, let's take a closer look at it. How rational do you think it is, first of all, for the government of a country, regardless of the government, to expect the NRC to be conducted on lines where a majority of the people will struggle to come up with documents? So clearly the kind of documents which are going to be required are going to be very trivial. Now even if that's not the case, let's say there are whole sets of people who get excluded from the documentation. It is a fair argument to make that people who are excluded, let's say those not belonging to a certain strata of society, would belong to all faiths. There would be Hindus in that, there would be Muslims in that, there would be Christians, Jains, Parsis, everyone. If you do not quite have documents that convince the government that you're an Indian national, and somehow apparently if you're a Hindu, you can say that you came from Pakistan and hence ask for citizenship under CAA. That is a bizarre claim because you cannot also have documents to prove that you were in Pakistan. Imagine the case, you're finding it tough to prove that you're an Indian, and yet you somehow magically have documents to prove that you came from Pakistan, right? This is a bizarre argument to say the least. Anyone who struggles under the NRC to prove that his identity is Indian will clearly have a much bigger challenge in seeking to prove that his identity is Pakistani. So the CA and the NRC and the hitching of the two is a nonsensical debate. And one must understand that this is fear-mongering. Opposing these acts by themselves on any grounds that you might have, individually and intellectually, is a sound exercise. Every democracy needs that. But trying to create warped theories where you're legally not backed out, even by the act themselves, is irrational and bizarre and very honestly quite dishonest. So anytime in the future when this debate is brought up, whether it's part of your selection process or otherwise, make sure that you have enough knowledge of what the act exactly is before you decide to take any stance at all. I hope you had an instructive understanding of both policies, and your talks and debates, whether it's GDs or VATs, would be better informed for that. Thank you so much.